Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Northrop Frye's 1951 essay, The Archetypes of Literature. So Frye is a pretty big deal Canadian literary theorist of the mid-20th century. And one of the things that he does is he builds on this idea that comes out of Jungian psychoanalysis. So Jung comes up with this idea, or he articulates this idea that the way that we experience, particularly dreams, is constructed through a shared collective unconscious. And this collective unconscious functions according to sets of recognizable images, which he calls archetypes. So basically, sort of the idea is that we all as humans, or at the very least humans within particular cultural contexts, share specific images and concepts that are meaningful in particular ways. So the archetype of, say, the old crone has a specific meaning, right? So in Jungian psychoanalysis or dream analysis, you dream about an old crone that tells you specific things about what your unconscious is processing. The same thing if you dream about, say, a spring day, right? This archetypically tells you stuff. If you dream about a lion. And nowadays, psychoanalysis has largely, I think, sort of moved beyond archetypes. Psychology as a scientific discipline certainly has, but literary theorists still find the idea of archetypes incredibly useful, in part because they tell us about how and why specific images are used and why they are evocative within literature. So Frye picks up this idea and he divorces it from the Jungian concept of a collective unconscious. Again, Jung's objective was a psychoanalytic one. So he was attempting to understand how the mind works. Frye's objective is a literary one, or a critical one, perhaps more accurately. And the impetus for this, as Frye says in the Archetypes of Literature, is this objective of making literary criticism more scientific. So what he says here is, so while no one expects literature itself to behave like a science, there is surely no reason why criticism as a systematic and organized study should not be, at least partly, a science. Not a pure or exact science, perhaps, but these phrases form part of a 19th century cosmology which is no longer with us. Criticism deals with the arts and may well be something of an art itself, but it does not follow that it must be unsystematic. If it is to be related to the sciences too, it does not follow that it must be deprived of the graces of culture. So what Frye is trying basically to do here is a similar kind of thing to what the Russian formalists were trying to do and what the new critics were trying to do. And I mean, Yuri Tynyanov in his essay, I forget exactly what the title of it is, on literary evolution, Yuri Tynyanov directly states this as the objective, right? To make the study of literature a science. Frye is in a similar kind of vein, right? A systemic, replicable, objective assessment of literature and the ways in which we study literature. Again, this project has sort of largely dissolved in the latter part of the 20th century, which in my personal view is probably a good thing. But the thing that Frye says, and this is sort of the problem that everybody who wants the study of literature or literary criticism to be scientific runs into, is I suggest that what is at present missing from literary criticism is a coordinating principle, a central hypothesis which, like the theory of evolution in biology, will see the phenomena it deals with as parts of a whole. Such a principle, though it would remain the centripetal perspective of structural analysis, would try to give the same perspective to other kinds of criticism too. The first postulate of this hypothesis is the same as that of any science, the assumption of total coherence. The assumption refers to the science, not to what it deals with. So basically what Frye means in this is that in order for the study of literature, in order for criticism to become a science as such, it needs a unifying, organizing principle, some theory in the scientific sense of a principle that explains the vast majority of the data without being contradicted by any of the data, right? The best explanatory framework that exists for the information available. It needs some sort of unifying central theory. And what Frye proposes is the theory of archetypes. And he connects this to myth. And here his terms get slightly idiosyncratic, I'll say. So what he says here is, the myth is the central informing power that gives archetypal significance to the ritual and archetypal narrative to the oracle. Hence, the myth is the archetype, though it might be convenient to say myth only when referring to narrative, and archetype when speaking of significance. In the solar cycle of the day, the seasonal cycle of the year, and the organic cycle of human life, there is a single pattern of significance out of which myth constructs a central narrative around a figure who is partly the sun, partly vegetative fertility, and partly a god or archetypal human being. So, to make that a little bit clearer, I think when Frye is using the term myth here, what he's talking about is what we sometimes call an story. So an story is the original version of a story. It is the version from which all other versions of a particular story derive. And so what he means by this is something like the overarching pattern for a story. So he doesn't necessarily mean myth in the sense of like Set fights Osiris, and then Osiris's dismembered body is reassembled by Isis, and Horus takes revenge. That's not what he means. He doesn't mean Dionysus is sewn into Zeus's thigh to gestate as a baby, right? It's not myth in this sense. It is sort of myth in the sense of the largest scale or most fundamental approaches to storytelling that human beings across cultures tend to share. Now, we don't necessarily need to go into the question of why human beings across cultures share these. Again, for Jung, it is about a collective unconscious. For Frye, he largely dismisses this idea, and indeed psychologists, psychoanalysts today largely dismiss the idea of a collective unconscious. For Frye, this is rooted more in a shared human response to the cycles of the natural world, which is part of the reason why the archetypes that Frye presents are very much rooted in nature imagery, in seasonal imagery, in cyclical imagery. So when he talks about, so to slightly step back and try and clarify this a little bit more, when he talks about myth, he's talking about the broad brushstrokes of stories shared by human beings across cultures. When he talks about archetypes, he's talking about the ways in which those stories, the elements, the images of those stories signify. That is, the ways in which they create meaning, right? So a story that, for instance, moves from spring to winter to spring again, we will generally have certain associations with that. There will be meaning to those seasonal shifts. And there are specific things that we would expect to occur with them, right? So, see the seasonal archetypes that he lays out here. Number one, the dawn, spring, and birth phase. Myths of the birth of the hero, of revival and resurrection, of creation, and because the four phases are a cycle, Frye does sort of assume a Canadian seasonal cycle, right? So societies that have, say, a wet and a dry season, have a monsoon season, whatever it is, rather than winter, spring, summer, autumn. Frye doesn't necessarily touch on that, but other people could in picking up this idea of seasonal archetypes. So, and because the four phases are a cycle of the defeat of the powers of darkness, winter, and death. Subordinate characters, the father and the mother, the archetype of romance, and of most dithyrambic and rhapsodic poetry. Number two, the zenith, summer, and marriage or triumph phase. Myths of apotheosis, of the sacred marriage, and of entering into paradise. Subordinate characters, the companion and the bride, the archetype of comedy, pastoral, and idyll. Number three, the sunset, autumn, and death phase. Myths of fall, of the dying god, of violent death and sacrifice, and of the isolation of the hero. Subordinate characters, the traitor and the siren, the archetype of tragedy and elegy. And then number four, the darkness, winter, and dissolution phase. Myths of the triumph of these powers, myths of floods and the return of chaos, of the defeat of the hero, of Götterdämmerung, which means twilight of the gods, and Götterdämmerung myths, subordinate characters, the ogre and the witch, the archetype of satire. So what he does is he connects the archetypes to the seasons, right? So again, things like the old crone, the hero, the damsel, the whatever it is, right? These are symbols that represent or connect with these sort of larger networks of meaning associated for Frye with these seasonal changes, right? So the old crone is out of place in the springtime, whereas the pastoral farmer in a sort of pastoral idyll is out of place in the winter, right? So there are these sets of associations that we have that link to these structures of meaning, of symbolism, and of narrative construction. And he also talks about the ways in which these work through different lenses and can be approached through different lenses, and how archetypes are connected in differing ways based on how we approach them. So he breaks down stuff that exists and how it fits within narrative structures of comedy or tragedy at sort of different levels of existence. The human, the animal, the vegetable, the mineral, and what he calls the unformed, which is sort of nature or spaces, water to a certain extent. So, for instance, he says of the human world, of human characters, in the comic vision, the human world is a community or a hero who represents the wish fulfillment of the reader, the archetype of images of symposium, communion, order, friendship, and love. In the tragic vision, the human world is a tyranny or anarchy or an individual or isolated man, the leader with his back to his followers, the bullying giant of romance, the deserted or betrayed hero. Marriage or some equivalent consummation belongs to the comic vision. The harlot, witch, and other varieties of Jung's terrible mother belongs to the tragic one. All divine, heroic, angelic, or other superhuman communities follow the human pattern. Right? So the idea that Frye is developing here is basically that if we chart the archetypes, if we map the archetypes of how they work according to he uses the structure of seasons and comic and tragic vision, right? We could develop a different schema. I don't think that Frye is sort of exclusively prescriptive here, right? I think he is more interested in the methodology than in the specific framework that he's constructing. And so if we mapped archetypes in a different way, I think that Frye would still say, yes, that fundamentally works as a tool for making literary criticism function scientifically, which is what he basically advocates for. And what he basically advocates for is that the unifying central theory that would give to the field of literary criticism a disciplinary coherence in the way, again, that, say, the theory of evolution does for biology. The unifying central theory would be the study of archetypes.